All righty, let's, I think it's time to get started here. We've had a tremendous response to this webinar. It definitely seems like a topic a lot of people want to dive into and learn more about. The newest member of our team, Dan Maenle, has graciously volunteered, or was he volunteered? Anyway, he's going to take us through it today. Please feel free to post your questions throughout, and we will pause from time to time and take those. But as for now, I think Dan, you can take it away.
All right, really appreciate it. So thank you for coming to the SQL Solutions Group webinar on Query Store, powerful tool. Trying to get my slides and everything just kind of put together real quick and finalized all of that. And there we go. So we do these webinars, frequently, monthly, bi-monthly, on different topics that the community can use. So one of the things I would just ask is, as we're going through this, if there are different topics that would be useful to you, if there are different topics in SQL Server, maybe there are areas that you're just you're unsure of, you could use a little bit more deeper dive training on, would be excellent for you to go ahead and share them with us. You can submit them in the Q&A, and we'll see about trying to get some of those topics for future sessions as we want to give back to the community. Again, this session, a powerful tool, SQL Server Query Store, was one of those ones that was recommended from the community. They wanted to know a little bit more about this. It's been around for a little while, and happy to dive into that. So thanks, community, for submitting different sessions and recommendations. So happy to do these. So my name is Dan Maenle. I'm a senior consultant here at SQL Solutions Group. As slide says, it's just the about me, president of Kansas City SQL Server Users Group. You can follow me on Twitter, and things that I enjoy. I love playing D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. I love traveling internationally, and right next as my favorite things is query tuning. It's what I love doing. It's enjoyable. I know I'm weird, but man, there are times where I'll tune a query just to help relax. That may not be you. And so if that's not you and you don't enjoy tuning queries and performance gains on servers and stuff, well, then that translates really to the next slide. Well, we are SQL Solutions Group. A little bit about us is that we're a Microsoft certified full service SQL Server consultancy. We do managed service provider. We can augment your SQL Server team, help out as staff augment. We can be full-time your DBA team. We can help out with doing a health check on your server. We can do coaching and teach some of your existing teams as well. So if you have any questions or if those are areas that you need, feel free to reach out to us. You can either post questions in the chat as well, and there will be some more information as well at the end. But enough of the housekeeping and stuff. Let's go over what we're here to talk about. And so number one is we're going over the agenda is, what is Query Store? Why do you need it? And how do you use it? Well, let's just start answering those. Let's get into that. So what is Query Store? Well, Query Store automatically captures data, queries, plans, runtime statistics. Depending on your version, it can also capture wait info of the queries that are running through on your system. As one point, I think it was in the Azure SQL database, they quoted it as saying it was the flight data recorder. It's capturing what's going on your system, the metadata, that's what's all running on your system, to be able to help you have more insight into that. What it is it's database level tracking on this. It's not built on the server level. You can't just, flip a switch, alter server or any of that. It's on a database level, and that can be really useful because we may have certain databases that are, our production server or our production databases. We may have other databases that are maybe more of a utility database, and we don't want to store it on those. So it allows us to have that kind of granularity. One of the limitations, though, is it is stored on the primary file group. And we'll get into that. How do we assign size and spacing to it? Unfortunately, we can't move that. It is required in the primary file group. So in regards to backups and stuff, when we talk about the sizing, keep that in mind. Used to be used on just the Azure SQL database, giving Microsoft some behind the scenes information on different things that are going on. And then they're like, oh my gosh, this tool is really awesome. Let's let everybody kind of use it. And so we originally got it on Microsoft SQL Server 2016. And it's available to every edition. A little bit quick about kind of how it works. So I got this from Microsoft's website. When you get the slide deck, you'll see I have notes on all that, citing the source and such. But as a query is running in the engine, you execute a query, you hit F5, your application sends something over. It's going to go ahead and take a look first, through the plan cache. So we start all the way up here at query execution, and then it goes through the plan cache, says, hey, do I already have this? Is this something that's already going on in the cache? And again, if it's not found, if it's found, but right in this section, it's sending those metrics of the plan text and the query execution plan over to query store. So this is happening just kind of like asynchronously, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to, tune some of those knobs. And sometimes as you see, it says plan forced. We'll get into that, how you can force some of those plans in case certain plans are better than others. And then after it executes the query and finishes it, it sends also the execution stats, the CPU utilization or the duration or different pieces of the execution over to query store as well to keep that. So that's a little bit about, what query store is. Now the question is, why do you need to use it? And why do you need it? Well, again, as I mentioned before, this tool was built into SQL Server 2016, all editions. Even on Express, you can get query store. The other thing is, as we see here, this is built into SQL Server 2016. You can also use it on lower compat levels, not compat level 2016. So if your compatibility level is 100 and you got some of those SQL Server 2008, 2008 R2 databases that you're just like, man, we've tried upgrading to 2014 or 2016 or so, and we always get some really bad plans. So we just set the compatibility mode and everything works. So we just leave it there. Well, Query Store might be the solution for you then, because you can, and I'll get to it later and more later, but you can go ahead and set Query Store on a database at 2008. I mean, if the SQL Server itself is 2016, but the compat mode is 2008, you can turn it on. So again, just the SQL Server has to be 2016 plus. It logs this information to disk for persistent storage. A lot of the stuff that we use for being able to see plans and query information, we've had to use the plan cache for. So if the SQL Server restarts, or if have memory pressure and things age out of your plan cache, you don't have that. So either you're having to get some third-party tool, or you're having to start querying stuff out and aggregating it yourself. Query Store handles that. It logs this to persistent storage, and it goes ahead and at that point can use that information after a restart. So if something did restart, it has that information about some of the plans and such when it does come back up. And this last point, that it receives continuous enhancements from Microsoft, I think is one of the strongest reasons why you should use this. Microsoft sees benefit in this. They're putting money, they're putting resources into this feature, and it's getting better every version. In SQL Server 2016, we could turn it on, we can capture stuff. I'm going to show you some of that. But then also in 2017, we added the ability to collect wait stats and wait statistics, which are a great way to know what's your bottleneck on your SQL Server, see what it's waiting on. So we get that added in Query Store. In 2017, we also get the automatic tuning options. I'll go into some of those as well later. SQL Server 2019, we also got abilities to kind of like turn some of these knobs and change how we're going to log to query store. In SQL Server 2022, we've heard some of the options of max degree of parallelism and cardinality estimator feedback. We also hear that they're going to be using some memory grant feedback. And one of the things that I get the most excited about for Query Store in 2022 is that it's going to allow writing to the query store on a read-only replica. So if you're using an always-on availability group and you push off all of your reporting and your, some of these just large queries to your secondaries, well, you don't really get insight to what's going on some of those because, it's a read-only. And so what do you have to do? You have to, maybe guess and check, or, well, let's see how this report runs. We run it on the primary, and you got to figure that out. Well, Query Store for 2022 with this read-only replicas should allow us to be able to have that option of gathering data. What's our secondary doing? What's our read-only replica being able to do? So again, Microsoft's putting time and money into this. Definitely should be using it. It doesn't cost anything. So I mean, that's always great too. And so the last part of it is, so we now know what it is, why you need it. I guess really the best question is, how do we use it? Well, unfortunately, I'm not just going to sit here and just talk about it. I'm going to show you some stuff. So let me get out my SQL Server, and I will show you a few things that I have on this. So just a moment, and I'm getting my screens rearranged. All right. All righty. So got a limited amount of real estate here, so we're going to try to keep everything available. So I've just got a couple different databases here. This is my laptop that I'm using, so it's not a huge, powerful server. But what I wanted to do is just kind of go over each of these options that Query Store has, how we can at least turn it on, because you can't use it if it's not on, and it's awesomely easy to turn on. It's this simple. One line of code, alter database, database name, set Query Store equal to on. Now you've got it on. I do want a couple things to just be known, is that the other options are off. And if you have it as off, there can be, and I'll get into later, some options that you might need to use this forced option. Again, I'll go over that reason later. I'll come back to it. But those are the two things, either it's on or off. We also have, we need to set the operation mode. There's only two modes. It's read only or read write. And this lets us be able to say, read write, hey, we're updating, we're putting data in, we're able to capture it. Read only would just say that, hey, I want to be able to just look at my query store. I want to be able to get some of it. Well, why would you want to only read data? Well, maybe you've taken a backup of something, you've moved it over somewhere, and you just want to be able to look at what had happened. You're doing a post-mortem. Might be a reason that you want to put it in read only. Or if you know, like, hey, I'm going to do some huge ETL process, I'm going to be something that's not normal, something that I don't need the data for, you might switch it over to read only and then do that, and then set it back to read write. Another option when you're setting this up is the cleanup policy. Now, this lets us know with this cleanup policy, the stale query threshold. If a query hasn't run in how many days, are you okay that Query Store not keep a track of it? Now, for me, the default here is 30. If it's on the Azure SQL Database Basic Edition, it's 7. If you need to increase these on-prem version, you can increase that with no problem. I believe it's on the Azure SQL Database Basic Edition. You might need to, it might have some premium expense on that to be able to increase that. Again, Basic Edition, you get kind of some of the basic usage. I'm fine with starting out on 30 days. If you've got certain workloads that are quarterly or maybe only once a month and you want to have some of those statistics and some of that query information, you might need to be able to increase that. Increasing that will then also need to increase in size. And we'll get to that, how we change that one in that command. The next option we have is data flush intervals in seconds. So this is basically, the default is 15 minutes, 900 seconds. And the question here is, how long are we allowing some of this data that we're capturing? You know, we talked about in that slide, after the execution, it sends data to the query store. Well, some of it's going to sit in memory buffers until it, you know, either hits this interval or isn't going to thrash your IO subsystem. So it gives a little bit of buffer room to do that. If you have a longer flush period, you could have some potential data loss only on the query store stuff. This isn't going to affect any of your other, you know, recovery points or such on your main database or your data, but just the query store data. Shorter flushes could cause your IO system to get more usage and a little bit more thrashing. So Microsoft's default's 15 minutes, but pay attention to some of your wait stats on it, and you might need to adjust, or maybe you don't. Probably the biggest one setting in Query Store, I would say, is the max storage size is an MB. I believe in the original Query Store, it was either like 200 megs was the default, and then in 2019, the default's now 1,000 megs. I would probably say, you know, your mileage may vary. How busy is your system? You probably have a little bit of a better insight on that. Do be aware that however much you allocate is how much, you know, it's not going to start using a whole bunch more size than that. It's not going to just start growing like your MDF or your LDF files and just keep growing. So this is going to be something that you can set it, and it's going to, you know, it'll use that amount. I'd probably say on most servers, even up to, you know, very large databases, 2 gigs, not too bad, not too crazy. The largest I've ever done and set one was probably about, you know, I think I set one to 25 gigs once, but it was because we were really doing some stress testing. We changed the intervals, as I'll get to next, and we had a lot more data that we wanted to really be able to do some baselining with. The interval length here, it looks like, you know, it starts at 15 minutes. The only options are 1, 5, 10, 15, 60, and 1440. Piece, every single query comes into your query store, and let's say it runs 100 times a minute. Well, if we aggregate it over an hour, well, we're going to put all those together for what the statistics are, the min, the max, and the CPU and write utilization. The longer the interval, the less total data you're going to put in there. The shorter the interval, the larger you may need the query store to be. So if it's something that you're actively going to be watching, you know, hey, I'm gonna set it down. And on a side note, you can change this in mid-flight. This isn't a set it once and you can't modify. If you're going to be working on, let's say, a test system or a prod system, and you want to really see, you're going to actively monitor some stuff and get a whole bunch of good data points, you could set it down and capture how this query and stuff changes as maybe you're making adjustments. But I'd say probably on the most part, for most production systems that I'm not sitting and staring at all day, an hour has been completely fine in being able to find out a lot of great information. But again, if you do make it a shorter interval, 1 minute, 5 minutes, do be aware it's going to require more space, or at least you won't have as much history in Query Store. I really like this next piece of Query Store, which is the SizeBased cleanup mode. You got either auto or off. Off means that there's going to be no purging is going to happen. It's not going to clean up. Once it hits that size limit that you assigned, it's going to then just flip over to read only. The auto, I think, is one of the great things that Microsoft put in on Query Store. If we have statistics or indexes in our system, we have to write maintenance. You know, we've got to either do some update statistics. Yes, we have some auto update statistics there, but we've got to maintain our indexes. We've got to do our integrity checks. We've got to do our backups. We've got to write all these different maintenance scripts. With Query Store, you just set it to auto. I mean, I would love it if I could set my kids to auto for cleanup, and then it's just, hey, they're just cleaning up automatically. It's happening. So you'll notice that when Query Store gets to about 80 to 90% full, it's going to start this process of just starting to clean up. It's going to start off with anything that's outside of the interval. So if we have our stale threshold of 30 days, if anything's older than 30 days, it will start cleaning that up. Do note that you may actually say your stale query threshold to 30 days. You could end up having 45 days worth of data, because if we haven't hit the size yet, it will continue to grab and hold on to that. It doesn't just say, oh, 30 days, well, we'll start this cleanup mode. A couple things to note is that when the SizeBased cleanup mode starts, if you have so much data coming into your query store that it can't keep up, and let's say you fill it up by the time and it can't clean it up, it will turn itself into a read-only mode and then continue to clean up until it gets its space reclaimed, and then it will go ahead and turn itself back to read-write mode as well. And there are some options in different tracing, different extended events to be able to track when that does happen. We can talk about that later. And probably one of the ones that I was mentioning here is the query capture mode. So a little bit weird, because I don't think I like the way that none means, but I'll talk about that. So all, as we can imagine, query capture mode all, it's going to capture all queries running on your system. It's going to capture, trivial plans. It's going to capture really expensive ones. It's going to capture things, every query running. None captures only queries that have existing plans. If it has a query ID and a plan in query store, it's going to add to those stats. So it'll continue to say, oh, hey, you have this stored procedure. We're on capture mode none. We've already run it before. So we're just going to keep adding to that data. We're not going to add all the new query plans that are coming in. It could be useful if you're running maybe a high stored procedure, object-based queries, or all parameterized queries that were not generating new query IDs. So, then your DBAs can run their stuff, and then you're not having to capture that. It's about the only thought I have, but that's potentially a reason why you would do it. And then auto is another option of it captures most queries. Microsoft has explained that as just not the expensive ones or infrequent ones. I don't know what that means. They don't show us what those values are. They don't tell us what those limits are, but for the most part, I kind of set things to auto. If I am running into really high queries, everything on the server are expensive queries, then what I might go ahead and do are I might set it to all if I need to, or I might use other metrics, other DMVs in the system to know, oh yeah, I'm missing some of these really important ones. So I might set it back to all, but do know all will capture all. Lastly, in 2019, SQL Server 2019, we do get another capture mode of custom. And this one's pretty nice as well. This gives us to say a couple different options here, and we can say it has to execute so often in a period of time. And right here, I've set it into 4 hours. There's a couple different options here. If you want to set it to hour, 4 hours, a day, you get a couple of those options here. And so I only want to capture data if it's executed 40 times in 4 hours. It had a compile time of 2,000 milliseconds and an execution time of 2,000 milliseconds. You can modify that as you'd like. So if you know that you only are wanting to capture, bigger queries, and you kind of, you really don't worry about the smaller ones, you can add a custom capture policy to that. And those are the metrics you do: execution count, compile, or CPU time, and execution CPU time. So that's really good at giving you some, again, Microsoft giving us more tools to do that. And then lastly, in SQL Server 2017, we did get the option to set query store wait stats capture mode on. And that is, again, getting us these metrics for what are the weights. Microsoft does group those weights together, and they do group them in regards to resources. So like CPU, memory, network, disk, They group a lot of weights, so sometimes we have multiple different weights in one area. So you'll it gives you a good idea, a good starting point of, oh, hey, maybe this query ran really long this time because of, oh, it was waiting for disk. Maybe it was a blocking query or something, or it was waiting on, a latch that it was trying to get. I've got them all listed out here, but you can just run them all at once, and that's totally good. Now, query store's on, and it's capturing data on that database, and you can easily check it from SysDatabases, name your query, name your database, and then whether it's on or not. So that's just how we turn it on, and my recommendation is turn it on. And every single database, even if it's just the defaults of, you're gonna be able to get some data. And that's the thing that I really like about it, is just you're gonna be able to get some. I want to talk now about just some of the common reports that you get automatically with Query Store. Now, I've been having queries running against this thing for a while, so we should have some interesting data to be able to pull back. Once Query Store is on, though, you'll see that it does show up here as an option in the database in the Object Explorer window. And if you open that up, you'll actually see what these different reports are. Regressed queries, overall resource consumption, top resource consuming, queries with forced plans, queries with high variation, query weight statistics, again in 2017 or higher, and then tracked queries, which we can then actually track specific queries. So on our regressed queries, this is kind of an interesting aspect of, this is just double clicking, bringing this up. Couple things to really note on any of these reports in this top section, this top bar up here. And unfortunately, I don't have a tool with me that I have ready to highlight things. But if you take a look right up here, it'll say top 25 regressed queries for database wide world importers, time period last hour. So what this is going to tell me real quick is that it's going to default to just the last hour. But the good news is we can also change that. Within this top area, we also have a couple different buttons: portrait view, landscape view, the configuration button. And that configuration button is where we can assign, do we want to do more? Do we want to go to the last 12 hours, day, 2 days, week, 2 months? Custom, if you want to dive into a specific date and time range, which can be really useful on, specifically on some of the other reports on, hey, what happened at a specific time? But if we just keep it in the last hour for this one, we have different slicers, duration, CPU, logical reads, writes, physical reads, all these different options in here, CLR time, degrees of parallelism, memory consumption. We've got all this stuff that's just being piped in from our queries running into Query Store. Once we have it selected on our configuration, we've got probably where I'd say is a good starting point for looking at any of your Query Store. It's a great graphical way to just kind of see what's going on. Again, here's our metric. We selected duration. You don't always have to go into the configuration option. We can go ahead and just change that here based on what we want to look at. Logical reads, duration, CPU. And again, this is in regressed queries. So this is telling me that we've had queries, and this is a single query, a single query ID. This one is 47507, that has had over the last period that we're looking at, over, what did I say, the last week. In the last hour, it says that we've had some regression where we've had very different performance. So at one point we had, as we hover over each of these areas, it's gone from an average logical reads of 16. And sometimes we have an average logical read of, oh my gosh, that's a big number. We can then start tracking and seeing what happened, what changed, what were, maybe it wasn't something necessarily with our query, maybe our data changed, maybe an index was added, maybe you name it, something could have changed on it. Could also let you know, maybe it's one you need to tune. And so as we take a look, again, we've got the top left, we've got, this nice bar graph. We can hover over, take a look at some of the values. And man, it gets really hard on some of these itty bitty bar graphs to see what's going on. So I'd recommend, this is the chart form. We also have the grid format. And so this gives us a little bit of a better understanding. You can kind of see what was the object name. You can sort by them. We can sort by the queries. Any one of these things, options can be sorted by. And we can take a look at how this looks at in regression perspectives. I like using this one if we've just done a maintenance. Maybe we've changed maintenance. Maybe we've gone from not doing statistics to doing statistics updates more frequently. Maybe we've just added some a compatibility mode change. Maybe we've just moved servers, or maybe we did a software upgrade. This would be a great thing to say. And, hey, we just did the software upgrade in the last hour. What's changed? What's regressed in that time period? And are these levels acceptable? Also, in addition, each of these axes, additional logical reads, we can change these as well to logical read, total logical reads recent. This is just additional. So we can actually look at, different slicers of what's happened. And so we can do that on the X and Y axis and look at that in a lot of different ways. So that's regressed queries. I want to talk now over kind of the overall resource consumption. And this breaks it down, as we can see, overall resource consumption for database worldwide last hour. And we can see, based on execution counts, duration, CPU, logical reads. Well, let's see kind of how maybe this looked over the last 2 days. That's when I was doing stuff. And we can see that over the last 2 days, we've, these are where our execution counts have been. We've had some time periods of almost 300 million executions of queries. And my laptop was screaming last night, I'll tell you. My wife thought it was going to fly away because that fan was burning so hard. We can take a look at durations. These are great ways to also find baselines. So if you've run an entire workload against something and you're like, okay, this is what we should be expecting. We haven't had anybody calling and complaining about execution or performance or anything. So this would be a good baseline. You can grab and look at a lot of these metrics of where your resource utilization is. And when you get another period, you can then use that and say, well, now how did that compare to our baseline? Any one of these metrics can then be you can dive into. So I can say, well, let's say this period of CPU time, I want to dive into that. It's going to take a second to open up. And it's going to be able to give us more in-depth of what were the queries that were running during that period of time. And apparently it wants to be mean to me and it wanted to close my management studio. I knew something was going to happen today, and it's probably just the Microsoft gods that are yelling at me, because right before 20 minutes before I started this, it said, "Hey, by the way, we have Microsoft patches we would like to install. Would you like to restart now?" And I said no, and so they're probably getting cranky at me for not saying yes. So while we're waiting on my management studio to start back up again, using these queries in this regard of the with the common reports allows us to, again, we can see the utilization of each of these resources, duration runs, execution counts. Maybe we implemented something and our execution counts go way up, and we found that, oh my gosh, there was a scalar function in a where clause and execution counts just jumped up. And so you can use that as a quick guide to getting into seeing what's going on. All right. Let me just go on to the next one at this point. So I love using this report. This is probably one of my favorite reports, which is the top resource consuming, because this gives me a great way to slice data for different periods of time. I use this one all the time for, hey, we had something happen last night at 3 a.m. oh, okay, last night at 3 a.m. Well, okay, well, we'll just do custom and we'll go to, 3 a.m. and we'll see, what was going on at, maybe 3 to 4 a.m. And I can just pipe that in and hit OK. And it's going to say this is what your top consuming queries were running at 3 a.m. this morning. Again, I also have the, I can take a look at it in this view. Looks like I was doing some, index maintenance as well. And it looks like I was also running a whole bunch of other queries, doing inserts and stuff like that. So, man, probably had some blocking maybe going on at that point. So it gives me some great insight into what was going on. Do be aware, as we see, we have create indexes and alter indexes and all of that. Those operations are logged as well. So modifying indexes, it might show up as this was your highest logical read. Yeah, it was a really big table, So you kind of just, be aware of that, move on, look at some of the other options that come up in here. See if I can find. I haven't really touched on it yet, but as we take a look over here on this right-hand side, we can take a look at a couple different colors. And what do those mean? Well, this is the same query. The query hash is the same, but the plan is different. It has different shapes. And that's one of the really useful and powerful things of Query Store, is that we are capturing multiple different plans, whereas your plan cache is storing one plan. And at this point, we're able to go ahead and, we can even, select multiple plans and compare them and see what's different. Now, I will tell you, I don't know why. I think I need to reinstall my Management Studio because my colors here are always, they're just slightly offset. I don't know why. I don't see other people having that, so it's probably just I need to reinstall Management Studio. But what this will do is this will highlight areas on both plans. You can see it's kind of weird. But you can see areas that are both plans, and it'll show you, hey, these are different. If we select a specific operator, you'll actually be able to see what's different. So on this one, it was just that it was a different node ID. On this one, and let me go ahead and pin that, it'll tell me that we had different estimated number of rows, and that's why it maybe had a different performance in each of those areas. So the cardinalities were different at the times they were run, so it might also be something that they have different memory grants. And so we can see compiled memory 1888 versus 2048. So yeah, the memory grant was different, which could change your performance. And so that's really useful. You do have the option, if you see any of these plans, oh man, maybe I really like this plan because this was maybe the best performing one. You do have the option to force it. It says, do you want to force it? Yep. And I see these little check boxes and it says, all right, next time I run it, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to use this execution plan style. And that can be really useful at times, especially if you've just done a 2008 to 2017 upgrade and you've had a regressed query. You can see the old cardinality style here, and it'll be like, oh man, the old one was the 2008 maybe, and then the 2017 was all the way up here. If you force it in the old cardinality, it handles that for you. It won't say, oh, the cardinality estimate's different. It'll go, no, I know what I need to do here. I'll just use that old cardinality estimator and such, and I can force that, which is very helpful when doing upgrades. Man, I would probably only use, I have to have Query Store when I do those upgrades now, just because there's always a query or two that just, goes a little sideways. Once you force plans, you might want to be able to find them. Well, luckily, they have it built in, queries with forced plans, and you can see all different plans that have force parameters. You do have the option to then over here to be able to unforce the plan. You can do that. It will also tell you if any time you have forced a plan, did it fail? If it fails, there is information as to why. Maybe it was that you can't use that plan because maybe an index that plan used was dropped. maybe it changed, maybe an included column that was in there was removed, or maybe there's just there's a variety of different reasons that it can give, and it'll give you a small description here of if it fails to do that. It'll also tell you, the last time it was, when it was forced, when it was run as being forced. So that's very useful. It lets you know the query IDs. You can then look into them, as well as the different performance options here. And we'll get into why this is a good report to use, because there can be situations where there's going to be a lot of forced plans, especially after 2017, and I'll get into those as well. One of the other reports that I liked is plans that have high variation. Now, my workload was pretty much consistent throughout. I did a couple times where I changed indexes and stuff like that. But if you see, it'll say this option is queries with high variation. And you can do this again on all your different slicers. And do you have plans that the logical reads change a lot based on different plans? This one is high, low, what's going on? Maybe it's the parameter that's being pushed in. Maybe it's not the parameter. Again, I was just running a big workload. It didn't have a lot of changes to the queries themselves or the parameters, but it was just a big workload going in. And so I do have some data points to say, hey, yeah, we had some variation. And again, do you want it the standard deviation? You can look at those. You can change the metric that you're doing those in. Very useful for if you see lots of plans with high variations, and let's say maybe you have a variation that's very low, one very high. It might be something of parameter sniffing. As we continue to look through just some of these other reports, again, I talked about in 2017, we've got the weight stats, and you can see, based on, each of the wait times, do you want the average wait time? This query right here was like all of my parallelism. I have one query that it was just constantly waiting on parallelism. Not necessarily bad, but it was. When you click on any of those, you're like, well, now I got to go open it again. There's one button that just appeared. That's this little green one. And we can go back to here. And we can see the network IO, idle, disk, latches, waiting on stuff. And then, where we have each one of them. So we can kind of dig into each one as our weights. Again, wonderfully useful in knowing, oh, hey, we had this one plan, the duration's really off. Well, let's look at it, and we can look at the weights and go, oh, well, this time we were waiting on disk. Okay, well, the disk resource could be really high. And then lastly, we also can just track queries. And I had a few that I think I was writing down. If I just wanted to grab a query ID, and where did I get a query ID? Again, I can grab it from, kind of wherever. There's lots of different areas in here where it'll have the query ID. On any of the other reports, top resource consuming, I can see this query ID here. If I hover over is 47507. So I could just pipe that in. So 47507, and I can hit go. I will say the one thing that's a little frustrating, if I could say something that frustrates me about Query Store, is that when you hit that green button to go, it doesn't tell you that it's running anything. And so you could just sit there and you're like, well, I guess you don't have any information. And that may not be the case. It's probably just retrieving the information from Query Store, and it's taking a little while. So that's just what it is. And so you can see like, oh, this query's had, changes over time. We can change the configuration for, what it's been over the last 2 days, the last 4 days, and such. It can be really useful in keeping an eye on things. I did want to touch base because I ran into this issue and I was like, why am I having this problem? As you can see, when I hover over this pipe right here, this bar graph, it says query ID, object name. And it's pulling that object name from, using the object ID against the system. And so that's the object name that's there. If I drop that object and recreate it, it will get a new object ID, and then that object name will be blank. It'll just not be there. So it is a good, method in 2016 plus if you want to be able to really track stored procedure utilization over time, altering your stored procedures rather than dropping and recreating them, because it does get a little hard at that point to start tracking. Hey, I've dropped it, recreated it, for testing a new feature. It doesn't track it all the same then. It's going to get a new query ID, it's going to get a new object ID and a new object name. So you might need to kind of piece some things together if that's the way that your company does things. I don't have an easy way at this point of just putting it all together and say, oh, well, this is what you need to do. There are some ways, but you have to do a little sleuthing. So those are the built-in reports that Query Store has, and there's so much more to go into. If you're trying to also find some problems with Query Store, probably and by problems I'm meaning actually Query Store itself is having problems. I usually just jump into the database Query Store options DMV. This will tell you kind of what's going on and your reasonings for some of this. So this lets me know it's desired to be in read-write, it is in read-write, and the reason is 0, which means all's good. Sometimes Query Store it'll say read-only, and there's a couple reasons for that I'll show. It can also be in an error state. I personally never had to work on a Query Store that's in an error state. The funny thing is Microsoft's first recommendation is turn it off and turn it back on again. And that's not your server. Don't get me. You don't have to restart the service. You can just alter database, set Query Store off, alter database, set Query Store on. If that doesn't work, it might be that there's actually corruption in your Query Store data. And so there is actually a DBCC check just for the Query Store data. It does have to be off. You do have to set Query Store off to run the consistency check. It will error out otherwise. So you would just set it. And I'm going to do this on an AdventureWorks database because my Wide World Importers is doing something. So I'll set that off. I can run the consistency check, and then I can turn it back on. And at that point, I can see that it's going to be looking good. The read-only reasons are here. I got these from Microsoft. So if there's any questions, please check the documentation. If you see a bitwise, so this is a bit style column. If you see something else here, check Microsoft documentation. It'll be much more up to date. One is read-only, single user, emergency mode. It's a secondary replica. Maybe it's full size. Maybe the memory limit is hit too high. You've filled the buffer for what Query Store is going to be using, and it's got to wait to flush to disk, or the disk size limit has been reached and can't grow. And this one's going to be an Azure SQL Database 1 only. And so I'll just show you that, right over here, we've got read-write. The read-only reason is 0. If we set the AdventureWorks to single user mode, we can go ahead and see that, hey, read-only reason 2, well, that corresponds to single user mode. And if we set it to emergency mode, you'll see that actually the read-only reason is 6, which means it's in single user mode and emergency mode. So that's how the bitwise works. I believe there are some functions people have written in the community that'll just parse that for you. So if you're a person like me, I love extended events personally. I'm just going to touch on it real quick. Query Store's got 93 events in SQL Server 2019, Service Pack, whatever I'm at, 4198. Lots of different things that you can do, lots of different things Query Store could be doing that you might want to get information on. Maybe you had a plan force that failed and you wanted to know more information. Maybe you had, you want to know whenever it's, size, getting over an allocated amount of space. If things got put into the buffer and that actually would put it over the size, maybe you want to know that. Maybe you want to know when it's out of space or when it changes its state. Lots of things you can do with extended events. And there's also some areas in the 2017 plus in regards to automatic tuning for when automatic tuning happens. Now, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I did want to say that there's lots of events that you can do in regards to Query Store with extended events for seeing what's going on and finding out, maybe there's errors or how often does it, how long is it taking to do those cleanup modes and how often they happen. You can use the extended events for that. The 2017 option here with the automatic tuning, I have a really good experience with this. I had a client that was on a system that I was getting probably a performance call every day from. They were on 2017. We had Query Store. I was tuning queries. I was doing indexes and everything. We had maintenance going well, but man, still something was coming up. And so there's this option in 2017 called automatic tuning force last good plan. Now, currently, this is the only option in on-premise 2019 for automatic tuning, which probably means Microsoft will do more with it, I hope. What this does is SQL Server using the Query Store data, again, persisted to disk, to find out what it can do. Are we having queries that are going bad or such? This is a quick example. It will show me that, hey, we had a query that was running at 1,597 milliseconds. If I use this other plan, I got it down to 494, so I'm going to force it. And it says it successfully did that. And as you can see, some of these might have expired. It did them previously. Statistics changed. Again, this query of parsing JSON also from the Microsoft website with a few little modifications to myself, but out on Microsoft's website there, links will be at the end. It shows if you've personally forced a plan or if you've unforced a plan, lets you know the status. And then it also kind of gives you a estimated gain in percentage wise of like how much did that do. And this automatic tuning, when I looked at that system, was just going all over the place. I had hundreds of entries in here of it just doing little tweaks, 5 milliseconds down to 2 milliseconds and 100 milliseconds down to 20. And I was like, I can't tune that fast. This was handling a lot of that little things that just were really great. I recommend using it. I haven't personally had any issues with using it. If you do, I'd be interested to know what, because I just want to be more informed. The one thing about this, all of these metrics as to the reason will be kept until a reboot, at which point they're flushed. It's just like any of your other DMVs, so you'll need to be aware of that. Some of these state options, active, verifying success, reverted, expired. It's not like, hey, it ran bad, or your query ran really well, now it's running poorly, we're going to immediately use the old one. It sometimes does take a few iterations, a few extra query runs for it to be able to figure that out. This is just some stuff that I used to build that query. Are two trace flags that I would recommend just being aware of, 7752 and 7745. Real quick, 7752 allows Query Store data to be loaded asynchronously on a SQL Server startup or failover. May be an issue because if it is the normal behavior now on 2019 to have that trace flag, but what this could mean is if you had a 50 gig, let's say you put Query Store to 50 gig and you fail over, it won't have that database come online on your always on until all 50 gigs are loaded into memory for Query Store and it's all ready to go. So that could be a problem. And for me, I'd rather my database be online than not. Trace flag 7745, kind of similar. It's for shutting down. If you just do a shutdown, of your SQL Server, it's going to flush all those buffers to disk. And personally, for me, if I'm shutting down a SQL Server, I want it to shut down. I don't care if I lose a little bit of Query Store data. And then there's lots of stuff that people are doing in the community. If you're into DBA tools, which, man, I really recommend everybody in the community be into DBA tools. There's a couple options. You can just copy DB store configuration from one server and put it onto another one. Real simple to just, and all my databases have it. You can pull Query Store options and you can set them individually. Eric Darling writes SP Quickie Store, really easy to use, helpful to track data, because instead of trying to, use the built-in reports, you can use things maybe you're more familiar with of what's the procedure name, or hey, I always see a lot of my update statistics as being high rate or high reads. I want to ignore those. A lot of that stuff's built into his functionality. Brent Ozars writes a lot of stuff. He's got SP Blitz Query Store. So just like his, Blitz cache and stuff, but this is against Query Store. And there's some Pluralsight courses. Aaron Stellato has one. Gail Shaw has another one. Great courses. I definitely recommend them to kind of go a lot deeper. And some of the stuff I've gone over should be very familiar as well. I also have just lots of links. Information about the automatic tuning, minor changes to Query Store, removing individual queries, how to use different blogs on Force Last Good Plan. And I recommend, if you're interested, I had as a primary resource, I want to shout out to Tracy Baggiano and Grant Fritchie, their Query Store for SQL Server 2019. Excellent resource. I don't think my camera will get it, but it was an excellent book. I enjoyed reading it, but again, I also find query tuning fun. So, all right, that was a lot of demos and a lot of real quick stuff. So let's kind of recap real quick. So what's the main lesson learned here? Use it. Turn it on any of your databases, and even the defaults can be great. It will be a great start to capturing data, being able to start using it, getting some benefit out of it. Even if it's just, hey, what happened at 2 a.m. this morning? What were the queries kind of running at 2 a.m.? What was happening during that interval that we saw this CPU spike? You can start answering those questions easily. The recap, so what is Query Store? It's a really awesome tool. It's built into SQL Server, it works on all editions. Why do you need it? Because now we're going to have more insight into our databases. We're going to know what resources are going to be utilized. And how do you use it? You turn it on, collect data, and you're going to be more aware of what's going on in your systems and environment. So I had a lot of stuff I wanted to cover. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about is Query Store. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them. If you have something that comes up later, you can email me. You can catch me on Twitter. I'm happy to answer any questions in that regard. So, Jason, did we have any questions? I know we're kind of getting real close to the end, though.
Yeah, we had some, and just overall, everybody will get a link to the recording for this. Let's see. Ben asked, what is the impact / overhead on very large databases?
So it's not going to be so much. The overhead is any tool, any monitoring, anything is going to have some. For very large databases, it's not so much on how big the database is where you're going to get the overhead. It's how fast and how many queries and how many different queries you're running. I was running, as we kind of at one point I showed, I had execution counts of over 300 million. And if I show you real quick, my Query Store is on this worldwide importer hitting hundreds and hundreds and millions of queries. I'm only using 36 megs.
Oh, yeah.
So
okay.
I'm hitting this thing really hard, but I'm doing the same thing over and over. If you're even on a small database, let's say you only have a 50 gig database, but you hit it with thousands and thousands of all ad hoc, completely dynamic SQL queries, it's going to get bigger. This was mostly running stored procedures. So you can see that, 36 megs in 2 days at 300 million executions an hour. So.
And VJ had two questions. Why forced plans are not forced always, and well, maybe go ahead and answer that one.
So with the Force Last Good Plan, if you're using that option, it may force it. So think of if we have a parameter that runs, and in the scenario, let's say we run one and it does an index seek, and it's able to get the data really fast, and then we had something happen and then it goes with a whole clustered index scan, and it's got a bad plan, and so it tries to force it to a different version using the Force Last Good Plan. As we see here, that was what this query specifically was. And when we do that, it might find out later, oh, I got something else that worked. Or again, if you did force it and something changed on the query, maybe again an index change that it can't do it, it might not be able to be forced. Hope if that I think that answers your question. If it wasn't, let me know.
Okay, and then he has, I have some performance issues on SQL 2019. Noticed new option, query capture policy. Do you have any good values which can be set on busy system?
So if we look back at the query policy, what you might want to start doing is, first off, this is useful, but also you might just want to start out with auto. And if you're finding that you're capturing too many of the queries that maybe you're not worrying about, you might have a custom capture policy. I personally don't have any best practices on that. It really depends on the workload that you're to kind of find out what's going on. So if it is you have a high compile times that you want to be capturing, maybe because the query is very complex, or you're really trying to capture queries that have a high CPU utilization, that's where you would modify those in the 2019. But I don't have any recommendations for that specifically.
Okay.
If I do find some that work, I'll be happy to post those out on a blog.
Yeah. Somebody asked about your slides. It sounds like you're going to share those. So we'll,
yes,
with the video link, we will do that.
Yep, and again, all of my links and everything like that, that's all going to be posted in there with the database project.
And then the last question, is automatic tuning available for all editions?
Oh, that's a great point. I thank you. That's an excellent question. And unfortunately, it is not. It is an enterprise-only feature on SQL Server 2017 plus. My hope is that it would be available on SQL 2022 standard. I hope and pray that they'll move that performance option down. But I had it in my slide and I forgot to say it. But you're right. The force last good plan for automatic tuning is only available on Enterprise Edition of SQL Server 2017 plus. And there are some options then in the background on the dashboard of Azure SQL Database. You have some options there as well.
Okay, well, I think that wraps us up. Went just a couple minutes over, so thank you all for sticking with us and having questions answered. And as mentioned before, we'll share this with you as soon as we can in the next 24 hours.
Yep.
And hope you can join us next time in June.
Yeah, and if you are interested in just any of the extra stuff of this is kind of like a 1-200 level on just an intro into it. What is it and how to use it? If you want that 300-400 level on using the extended events and using some real deep dives and going into it, let me know. I'm interested in writing it, but I want to see if people would be interested in hearing about it. So
awesome. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.